Welcome to Legally Speaking, a podcast from the Utah Attorney General's Office, Utah's preeminent law firm. Here we will discuss matters of policy and justice, cases that our office is taking on, hot topics in Utah and in the world, but of course, it'll all be done legally speaking.
Hello, I'm Richard Pyatt from the Utah Attorney General's Office. Welcome to Legally Speaking, the official office podcast. Joining me today is Kevin McLean with the White Collar and Commercial Enforcement Division. Kevin's the one who's responsible for negotiating the opioid settlements that are going on. A lot of people affected by the opioid crisis, a lot of people wanting to get money out of the companies who they feel are responsible for the opioid crisis and exacerbating it. Thanks for coming in today, Kevin. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So tell us about the settlements. I know that there's more than one. Kind of give us an overview of what the picture is here in Utah as far as what kind of money we're getting from where.
So there are two settlements that are occurring right now. One is with Janssen, which is a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson. The other is with AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal, and McKesson, which are the three largest drug distributors in the country. Cumulatively, their market share is, I forget exact numbers, but something like 80%. There are some small regional players, but they do most of the drug distribution.
So has it been established, have the companies basically admitted, yes, we were helping accelerate the opioid crisis? By the virtue of the fact that we have this settlement, are they admitting this? Is that part of it, do you think?
Not as such. They've admitted to failures in regulatory oversight and compliance, but they've not admitted to pure culpability.
Okay. But still, they want to dispose of these cases, and so we're in settlement negotiations with one, the other with J&J, we're already complete. Correct? That's all final?
Both agreements are finalized.
Okay. All right. So when we hear the national dollar figure, like one of them was 26 billion.
Yes, that's the two settlement agreements combined.
Okay. Sounds like a lot of money, but it's not an unlimited amount of money. So how does that filter down to Utah? Tell us a little bit about the criteria of how the decision was made to get Utah get the amount that they were getting.
So Utah, as of the reference here, had almost exactly 1% of the country's population. In the settlement agreements, Utah is getting about 1.18% of the settlement agreements. And that was based on three criteria. The first was the number of pills, opioids, shipped to a particular state, the rate of opioid use disorder, and the rate of opioid-related overdose fatalities. Utah was particularly hard hit, which is why Utah is recovering more than population alone would suggest.
Okay. But the dollar figure isn't going to be in the billions, it's in the millions, right?
For Utah?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. 26 billion was the total national figure. Do you happen to know Utah's exact combined figure?
About 265 million.
Okay. Over 18 years in both cases?
Yes, that is worth noting.
Okay.
I'll be 60 when this is resolved.
Okay, so when we consider the amount of money spread out over 18 years going into the communities, if someone had someone who died from an opioid overdose and they're thinking, okay, great, we got this money, what's in it for me? What are the direct community impact expected to be, would you say?
Treatment and prevention.
Okay.
It won't result in payments to families of victims, to victims. Unfortunately, the resources don't exist for that. Literally no amount of money can compensate for the losses people have experienced.
And A.G. Reyes has stated in his previous dealings with the opioid settlement that there's really no amount of money that can compensate families for the pain and the suffering that they've endured, or the people that are dealing with addiction either.
But we can try and reduce it.
Right. Now we have most of the Utah counties that are participating in these settlements, but we have two counties that decided that they did not want to participate. Do they believe that they can get a better deal on their own?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they do. And I'll admit that they were particularly hard-hit counties. They're small, and their populations are part of the reason that their recovery, if they had participated, was not going to be terribly substantial, but they were particularly hard-hit counties.
But you negotiated on behalf of Utah with a coalition of the rest of the states, right?
45 states, I think. I think there were 5 that held out.
Okay.
I might be off by 1.
Do other states have this issue too, where there are individual communities that didn't want to participate in the larger settlement?
Absolutely.
Okay.
There are some states where the majority of their political subdivisions chose not to participate.
Okay. How would you put it as objectively as you can? Because I know that you're on this side of it, but
Yeah.
what are the realistic chances that these smaller communities can negotiate with these large companies on their own and get more?
Well, they can't negotiate for more in a settlement agreement because there's a most favored nations provision in the settlement agreements that says that if the distributors or Johnson & Johnson settle with anyone else for more, they have to let the rising tide lift all the boats. And candidly, I don't think they have a whole lot more money than we've already extracted. It is possible that they could obtain more in a judgment if they were to prevail at trial.
Right. There are pretty strong feelings about this in the 2 counties, Grand and San Juan County, have decided not to participate in the agreements. Those counties were hit really hard, and I don't think there's any hard feelings about that. If they want to try to get more money out, you say welcome.
Absolutely.
To the table, right?
It's a rational decision and one that I understand.
Right. Okay. So when we're talking about this coalition of state, what was it like negotiating? Did you feel like Utah actually had a voice in this? Did you get a chance to pipe up and say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't going to work for Utah? Or, okay, yes, we joined this other state in thinking this way.
I would describe it as a very collaborative process. It was, I think, all 50 states that were working on the settlement negotiations throughout most of the period. Different states took different roles. Utah had a particular role initially in the investigation into the conduct of Cardinal Health, one of the distributors, but the states kind of divvy up the work. And we weren't very often directly engaged with the companies that we're settling with, but we were definitely very engaged with the group of states that were handling that part of the negotiation directly.
Okay. Did you feel swept up in what the other states wanted sometimes? Did you didn't feel Utah was getting bullied because we're a smaller state, or 1% of the problem?
I would say the opposite of that. We had a lot of information early on about the company's financials and their ability to pay. The companies, frankly, are an important part of the provision of healthcare in this country. They play a pivotal role, and their margins are razor thin. Their margins run about 1%. So while they have enormous market cap and they look like very large companies, they don't generate revenue proportionate to their size. In the negotiations with the other states about how the funds were going to be divvied up, it was recognized that Utah was one of a number of states that had been particularly hard hit, many of which have smaller populations, frankly. And the metrics that were used, again, that was number of pills, rate of opioid use disorder, and rate of opioid-related overdose deaths, favored those smaller, harder hit states. The group of states also decided to take a share of the total and distribute it across a number of small, particularly hard-hit states. Utah fell just outside of the threshold for that, but I think it demonstrates that none of the states were trying to bully anyone. As I mentioned, Utah is recovering more than population alone would dictate. Some of the larger states, Texas, California, Florida, are recovering substantially less than population would dictate as a result of the way that the funds are being distributed. Okay. So I think the settlement was the right deal. I don't think we were swept up in that. and I think that the way the states came together to decide how to distribute the funds was as fair as it could possibly have been. Was it perfect? No. And there are states that aren't thrilled with how it played out.
Right.
But I think we got pretty close.
But you mentioned earlier that there may not be enough money left to accommodate, any kind of significant further negotiations. So these companies have a lot of money, but they don't have unlimited money. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So what's your overall assessment of the opioid problem in Utah and how the settlement interfaces with that, and your satisfaction with how everything turned out?
The problem is still bad in Utah. There's been some reporting that the numbers have improved in Utah, but that's not entirely accurate. This last year was the worst year for opioid overdose deaths ever. There were more than 100,000 people who died related to opioid use disorder. The rate increased in Utah. It increased less in Utah than in some other states. So reports that it's improving in Utah are simply not correct. We need a lot more resources. The funds from the opioid settlements are required to be spent on opioid treatment, prevention, education, post-treatment support, things like that. And I think that's the right use of the funds.
Okay.
There's some pretty tight strings on it.
Right. So your part of this is over. So once we start getting the money, what's the process for divvying it up to the various counties and the municipalities and the communities affected?
So the counties and their constituent municipalities are going to work out their own agreements. The funds are going to be split 50%, 50-50 between the state and the counties that are participating. The funds are going to go directly to the counties. There's a settlement administrator who will cut the counties the checks. It doesn't even pass through state hands before they get them. The funds for the state will be put into a restricted opioid spending account that the legislature created in 2018, I think it was the session when they did it.
Okay.
And that fund is required to be appropriated for opioid epidemic related spending at the state level.
Okay. A lot of expectations about this with this money. Does it surprise you that there are so many people scrambling to get a piece of it?
I would describe it differently. I don't know that I think they're scrambling to get a piece of it. I think there are a lot of people who are really passionate about this.
Mm-hmm.
It's touched everyone. Everyone I know knows someone who's been affected by this epidemic. And I think there's just a lot of passion around trying to address it with people's various skill sets and programs and whatever.
Okay. So what's your work experience that you are now negotiating with these other states, with these big companies? Do you have what does it take? You don't fill out a job application for that kind of thing.
No.
How did you get into that expertise?
Well, I don't know about that. I primarily represent the Division of Consumer Protection in the Department of Commerce. And when the multi-state community started looking at the opioid cases, what we were looking at first was the misrepresentations that the pharmaceutical companies were making to prescribers. So we were looking at it as a consumer misrepresentation and omission kind of case. They overstated the benefits of the drugs and they understated the risks associated with using them, and as a result, massively drove up prescribing. So it was in my capacity as counsel for the Division of Consumer Protection that I initially got involved in this.
Okay.
And it just evolved over time. The legal theory's changed. It's viewed more as a public nuisance case now than as a consumer protection related case.
Yeah.
But that's how it started.
Okay. So did I ask all the questions that your friends usually ask you, or people that know that you're involved in this? Do they want to know anything in particular that maybe we could add that would answer that question for our podcast audience?
Not about the settlements, really. They tend to want the dirt. They want to know what I've heard that the public hasn't.
Okay.
And at this point, there's not much. A lot of documentation has been made public. A lot of the reporting has been very thorough. But those tend to be the kinds of questions I get the most often.
Okay, all right, good. Well, I appreciate you coming into the office today in our law library, which is actually a conference room. But I appreciate you coming in to answer my questions and the questions on behalf of our audience, and I appreciate your time.
It was my pleasure.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks.
Kevin McLean from our office, at the AG's office. I'm Richard Pyatt. Thank you for joining us today for Legally Speaking. We'll see you next time.